that Royal Navy effort to stamp out slavery that you talked about, that was something like 2% of Britain's GDP every year for 65 years to police the world's oceans, and not even the British Empire, it's just everyone who might be contravening it.
Well, to think about the compensation to the slave, and people now use that as an example of why we're collectively guilty. It's the complete other way around. Essentially, you had very, very, very strong political and economic elite interests concentrating in Parliament. We were not a democracy, by the way. It's an aristocratic kind of elites who essentially resisted the abolition of slavery. So it was a way of the British government paying these people off to accelerate the ending of slavery. So the idea that, and absent that, you basically have given them money to end the disgusting trade in human souls. So so it's compensation, but compensation designed to end it as quickly as possible. And that was 40% of GDP. Imagine what would have been done with that money. I mean, this is back then, we weren't as morally advanced, quote unquote, as we are now. Imagine 40% of GDP. The GDP in this country is about, it's like, today is a couple of trillion. I mean, that's
3 trillion, I think.
3 trillion. So, relatively speaking, and this is in the context of mass infant mortality, mass urban slums, desperate poverty, people living in like 10 people in a room in the East End of London, where my family come from. Imagine what would have been done with that money. So that money, undemocratically, by the way, was used to pay off to end the transatlantic slavery. Imagine what we could have done with that money if we put that in, for example, the London slums or the Glasgow slums or the slums of up north. You see what I mean? So, and yeah.
That's a good example of what it could have been done to help out the common person and their conditions. And I suppose even the example that you highlighted also undermines the concept of white privilege, which ultimately, Douglas Murray has also spoken about at all, is whilst he was privately educated, his whole family are from a long line of people who once occupied the Highlands, who were then obviously cleared out and they worked the land. Said, I don't have privilege. I got here because people worked with whatever they had and moved along with the conditions. And clearly those people in the East End of London, or the people down the pits later on in the northeast of England, where I'm from, that's not privilege. But
this is why this is a culture war. This is why I think that I said culture war. Michael Lind, who I think is fantastic, he talks about the culture war as a class war, and I completely buy that. And that's why. So you think about this narrative. Essentially, the woke left, the progressive left now, across institutions, the BBC, the Channel 4, they push this absolute crazy narrative of collective white guilt. But the reality is, white people, this country is a Northern European, I hate to break it to people, but it's a Northern European country. And prior to 70 years ago, it was about 99.9% white. And so white people, as the left designate them, as collectively guilty, right? So what you've effectively got is you've got massive urban slums, okay? Huge amounts of money used to end the transatlantic slave trade. Then, post-war, the same economic elites that benefit from slavery usually, that are in the government, okay, now start pushing mass immigration policies. Where do those immigrants tend to end up? They end up in working class communities. I'm from Hackney in East London. I was an ethnic minority in my class as a young kid. Went to inner city schools, right? Ethnic minority. It was a very diverse upbringing, and it was great. And it was also absolutely awful. But the influx of mass amounts of immigration back in the day, let alone now, where it's gone really on steroids, did cause all kinds of dislocations. And, as natural, if you live in a small rural community, I used to live in a small rural community, you get like 5 people moving in there and they're like, who are these people? And it takes a process of integration, let alone in a desperately poor working class community that's been established there, has been bombed in the war, massive bombing. Prior to that, we're living in absolute slums, still can't live in slums, still desperately poor. And the immigration inflow as a result of economic and political elites saying, oh, we want to bring immigrants in now, go into these desperately poor communities, and the strain that puts on local services and schools And I hate to say it, but the destruction of pre-established communities. That would happen whoever goes in there. You took a load of, you're from White North, you just said, right? You took a load of Northerners from Hull, or I don't know where you're from, but I say Hull. You put them in London. So it's not even racially coded. It's people that aren't, different types of ways of being, different types of communities come together. And it leads to a kind of fusion at some point, one hopes, and a positive fusion at that, one hopes. But it's very dislocating, especially in the context of already desperately poor communities. So that's why I think this stuff's a class war. You've got educated elites, public institutions, the BBC, essentially are pushing what is a discourse and an ideology of collective racial guilt on the part of white people, right? When the people that have actually borne the brunt and invariably got on with immigration, mass immigration, are very poor white working class communities. That's where the genuine anti-racism is. Not sat in a seminar with some highly paid consultant coming in from California, had it all the time, going on about white privilege and white fragility. It's the organic, multiracial communities I grew up in Hackney, where my grandmother was an old Cockney matriarch, right? She was born in Hackney Wick in East London, completely white. I know the BBC finds some black trumpeter from about a couple hundred years ago and says that's utter nonsense, right? Basically, so completely white, very poor East End Cockney white working class communities. And when she died, at her funeral were people from all over the world, loads of Jamaicans. I grew up I'm from Hackney, right? So it's kind of like my cultural background, believe it or not, is kind of white working class Cockney and a kind of Jamaican fusionism. It's kind of like, it's very much like a sort of like and it's not a race thing. It's kind of an inner city thing, a ghetto thing. And as the older I get, I kind of look back at it. I was there for 25 years. I kind of feel it more and more. It's kind of it's a fusion thing. So it's kind of it's a very, very funny discourse. You get this upper middle class preaching elites telling very white working class people they're beyond the pale, their political concerns are they're unreconstructed racists. They have to accept all the liberal hegemonic nonsense that's pushed on them all the time. And the progressive catechisms that we see are essentially it's a political faith-based system. And if you don't accept that, you're a heretic and you're morally beyond the pale and to be cancelled or cleansed or, dealt with in some way. Anyway, it's a bit of a rant now, but, yeah.
A very well put together rant, Doug. Don't worry about it. Connecting a few dots from some of the points that you've made so far. So you talked a little bit about decolonization and how the process of political decolonization, i.e. end of the colonial powers, happened a long time ago. And now you've got this big ideological thing, which is let's expunge anything that might be connected to this part of the world, I suppose, the Anglophone West, because it's racist, it keeps people in their box, and we need to overthrow it if we're all going to be liberated. And you said there's a risk here that by employing these tactics, that should the pendulum swing, that it may swing back and someone's going to employ those tactics. And as you were sharing your story there about growing up in a place that was previously an ethnic majority of white British and probably white Irish, you then saw it all change, and so did your granny, saw it all change. And I suppose I've noticed that there are some thinkers on the right who've recently been writing about how, well, if we're talking about colonization, then we're going to make the argument that mass immigration is a form of it. And so I wonder if the pendulum does ever swing, that actually those people who are currently employing decolonization as their battering ram against the current political, well, it's not even the status quo, is it? Let's be honest. It's a kind of bogeyman. Then that looks like it might already be swinging to come back their way. It seems to be part of the talking points, I suppose, of the emerging right, which is, oh no, if we're talking about colonization, well, countries that are recipients of mass immigration, they're being colonized, and they're throwing around all the percentages of ratios between white Britons, for example, and everyone else in London, and how that's now at something like 36%. It was just under 50% in 2011. It was 25% higher than that 20 years before or something. So do you think that is a what does that represent? Is that a risk? Is there a risk that this gets a bit nasty?
I think potentially. I don't know. I mean, I see a lot of stuff now on that. It's on the edges of that stuff that I think is almost racist, and I find that very problematic. I think that I cannot completely understand the frustration post Brexit. In terms, Brexit was about ultimately rebalancing the political economy of this country to mass immigration. No matter which way you swing it, if you look at the data now, it's pretty clear, has lowered the wages of ordinary white working class people. Basically, we do have now a very skewed political economy. Again, one of the frustrations you've got with the Tories. I think it's like 8.5 million people now are economically inactive on some kind of benefit of some kind, whilst we're importing huge amounts of parts of the world. And so I think that is clearly not a sustainable model. I'm not an expert on immigration, by the way, but I think to myself, you do have a lot of people coming in, and obviously it places an incredible strain on social services. So it's a tough one. I think that you have to ultimately rebalance the economy. If you have objective needs within the economy, then who's going to do the jobs? So if Brits, I think if you had a much lower immigration system, to go hand in hand with that, you'd have to have a massive welfare reform package as well, right? And that's the simple truth of it. There's a lot of businesses are bringing people from immigration in, low skilled immigration, to do the jobs that unfortunately a lot of Brits won't do. And also, I should also say, I mean, a lot of this narrative around immigration, the vast majority of immigrants, in my experience at least, and this is me growing up in Hackney, one of the most multiracial places in the world, right? Yes, there was tough moments. Yes, there was a lot of crime and a lot of stuff like that, right? But the vast majority that I've experienced has been, people, when they're here, they often try to integrate. I see a lot of stuff now, especially on X, and I find it a bit beyond the pale. It doesn't sit well with me. It doesn't sit well with me. I think that there is, and I wouldn't want any kind of like castigation of communities, wholesale castigation of communities. I just think that's a recipe for disaster. It doesn't mean that, you feel frustration or you kind of feel that you want some degree of cultural continuity. I get all those things, but the mass castigation of people, or I think if it went in that way, nobody wins there. Nobody wins there, because then what you have is you have people pitted against each other, and that is just a recipe for disaster. I was in Bosnia just after the war, and when it was settled, but where I went was still very hot, and still in Hackney too. But especially in Bosnia, Bosnia was a fairly integrated multi-ethnic or multi sort of religious community. And it didn't take that much to really push it over the edge. I mean, we're talking about often the model that you saw in Bosnia was you'd get a couple of hundred death squads guys would go into villages, kill people and drive them out. And then the army will follow them in. I've seen what that looks like. I've stood at mass graves where hundreds of bodies are being dug up. I've seen that in the flesh. Walking down where I lived, basically the last place I lived in Bosnia was overlooking a massive death camp. It was an industrial camp. They'll kill people en masse and throw them in the river. You'd walk everywhere you go, there'd be mortar rounds and bullet holes everywhere. Often at head height, they'd line people up. So I've seen where that goes, and it's not pretty. It's not nice. So I think that we, sometimes you've got to take a little step back here and try to rebuild it. Yes, it's frustrating. Yes, the Tories are really lost. I think people are so angry with the Tory party, and you're going to see it in this election. And the reason people are so angry with the Tory party is because the Brexit vote was about sovereignty, rightfully so. It was about national sovereignty in the face of an unelected EU superstate, right? That's a very powerful message, and it's a very true one too. But it's also that immigration was about ultimately having a moment to breathe and to resettle and to sort of work out who we are and to, rebalance the political economy. And what the Tories did, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, what the Tories did is they basically put two middle fingers up to the British people and they put this stuff on steroids. So people are very, very angry about this. This is why when Labour gets in, I think they're going to go make people are so, Labour are going to win because centre-right people are not going to vote. So they're not going to people aren't voting for Labour. They're just not voting for the Tories. So if Labour goes down that path of woke nonsense, race equality acts, and mass immigration, or just fudging the figures a little bit more, and all the other progressive nonsense that you see, the absolute twaddle that you see, right? I think you're going to get a massive reaction.